Hey guys, before we jump into the podcast, I just wanted to let you know that as in previous years, I'm going to stream a free series for Lent. And many people, thousands of people from all over the world have participated in the Science of Sainthood series in the past. I'm going to show you a quick preview of the new one in a moment. And you're going to want to see it because this year's is all about one of the least controversial subjects ever, the liturgy. I know, right? But the point of this series isn't to wade into the liturgy wars. And if you don't know what the liturgy wars are, God bless you. But this is a study designed to go below the surface and penetrate the mystical realities of the Mass. In fact, that's part of the title. It's called Liturgy and Life, Unveiling the Mystical Movement of the Mass. So why do we do what we do? Where does the Mass come from? What do the rituals and rubrics point to? What is the underlying reality that gives power to the sacramental words and actions of the Church? How do we engage that reality so that our lives are transformed? So there's a lot to dive into. This is probably unlike any other series on the Mass you've ever done. And again, I'm going to stream it for free beginning Ash Wednesday. There are 6 lessons that are about 15 to 20 minutes long each, so you got plenty of time to get through it. So look for a link to sign up down below. If you're watching this on YouTube or wherever, if you're just listening on a podcast player, go to scienceofsainthood.com and the sign up is at the top of the page. But first, here's a short preview from lesson 1.
Remember what Jesus said. The hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for such the Father seeks to worship him. In other words, Christ has come to raise the worship of God's people to its highest and most perfect expression this side of heaven. His gift of living water enables us to worship the Father in spirit and truth. This is a worship far surpassing the ancient worship of the Samaritans on Mount Gerizim, or even that of the Israelites in the Jerusalem temple. Why? Because the current of this living water propels us into the mystical river of God's very own life. It is God flowing into us and lifting us up literally to share in his divine life. It grafts us into the supernatural communion of love we call the Trinity. That's the breathtaking power of the living water that flows in and through the liturgical actions of the Church. And that's the living water we're seeking in this series. So when I say this study is focused upon liturgy, I don't mean we're going to solely discuss parts of the Mass or other forms of liturgy. As important as they are, we're going beyond the externals, beyond rubrics and rituals, beyond vessels and vestments. We're going to explore the deeper mystical realities that unite us to Christ. Why do we do what we do? What do the rituals and rubrics point to? What is the underlying reality that gives real power to the sacramental words and actions of the Church? Because without that reality, the rules and rubrics are empty. They're just human actions, empty pipes with no water flowing through them. Even pagans raise their hands, kneel down, bow, and offer sacrifice. So there must be a deeper level. Otherwise, there's no real point. All of our liturgy must ultimately flow from a source beyond us, or we're just humans doing purely human things. And as we'll come to see clearly, that's not the case. But not only are we going to penetrate the divine mystery of where the liturgy comes from, we're going to illuminate where it's all going. Because we're not meant to simply say a few prayers, light a few candles, and shuffle up and down the aisles of our local parish, and then come back a week later to do it again. The liturgy in which we participate is designed by God to move us into a mind-boggling union with him that almost defies any description. We're talking about participation in the divine nature of God, a gift so ridiculously incredible that even the most eloquent descriptions fall to the floor as mere stammering and stuttering. Even so, we're going for it. We're going to plunge into the living waters of true liturgical life and go exploring. Why? Because this is what it's all about. This is the pearl of great price. This is literally what we're made for. Now, obviously, we can't cover everything, but the goal of this Science of Sainthood series is for us to lower our buckets into the water that wells up to eternal life and drink as deeply as possible.
Hope that whetted your appetite for the series. I really do think this is a game changer. I can tell you that just the researching and preparing this series has had a deep impact on my understanding and participation in the Mass. Now, if you're wondering, yes, there is a workbook that's available as in the past. It's got lesson reviews, space for journaling and notes, review and discussion questions for groups, etc. Now, as of recording this, it's at the printer. You can pre-order a copy from the Science of Sainthood. There's also a digital version, just like in the past. That's in case you live overseas or you just like it that way. And you'll have an opportunity to get that workbook after you sign up for this series if you want one. But again, this series is streaming for free beginning Ash Wednesday. So look for a link to sign up down below or go to scienceofsainthood.com and you'll see the sign up at the top of the page. Many thanks to my supporters and the members of the Science of Sainthood for making this possible. And by the way, if you're a parish admin or a group leader, you're looking for another study for Lent, or you want to do it in conjunction with this one, or you're looking for something at any other point of the year, take a look at the group studies available at scienceofsainthood.com. They're unlike anything else out there. We have group starter packs that give you access to the videos and start you out with a number of workbooks as well. Okay, it's a one-stop shop. But God bless, and let's get to the interview. Ladies, if you were wondering what the heck happened to ladies, and men, you're wondering the same thing, like how in the world did everything get so upside down with sexuality, gender? Am I supposed to hold this door open or not when a woman is coming behind me, guys? If you ever asked those kinds of questions, and how all this kind of crazy stuff happens so fast, then I've got a show for you, because we're going to get into the sordid backstory of the entire feminist movement, and not just how it's impacted women, but how it's impacted men as well, and explain where it all came from, and again, how we got here in such, it seems like, the blink of an eye. All right, so this is going to explain a lot of things. We're going to get into the surprising role of the French Revolution. Like, the French Revolution, what does that have to do with the feminist movement? Well, you're going to hear about that. Communism and Marxism, how that plays in, how even the occult plays into some of this stuff. That was an eye-opener for me. And trust me, once you start to see this, the scales are going to fall from your eyes, and this backstory is going to be exposed, and you're never going to look at the national conversation in the same way again. But we're not just going to talk about the problem, we're going to talk about the solution as well. And in order to do that, I would like to welcome to the Art of Catholic, Dr. Carrie Gress. And let me give you the tail of the tape on Carrie real quick before we move on. She is a very popular guest on this show. I've had her on multiple times, and she's also an old friend. But here's the credentials. She is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a scholar at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. She is the founder and co-editor of the online women's magazine Theology of Home with Noelle Marion, who we've also had on the Art of Catholic. She's written 10 books. I can't believe it's that many already, including The Anti-Mary Exposed and The Marian Option, both of which we talked about here on the Art of Catholic. And she lives in Virginia with her husband and her 5 kids. Today, we are going to be talking about her latest book, which is called The End of Woman: How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. Let me get that clear in the picture. There you go. Fantastic book. Love it. And I'm excited to talk to you about it. Carrie, welcome back to the Art of Catholic.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back. It feels like it's been too long, right? I guess I should have written this book more quickly.
Well, you should always write more books more quickly, because I love your books.
Oh, thank you.
I was coming home from a speaking engagement last weekend, and one of the co-speakers was flying home with me, and we're getting on our last leg of our flight, and you're like, how am I going to make it through this last leg? It's super late at night. He turned to me and he said, "You got any books?" And so I had 2 with me. One of them was yours, and I handed it to him, and he's like, "Oh, this looks interesting." I only let him have it for a few minutes because I was still prepping for this podcast, right? And by the time he got finished with just a little bit of it, he's like, I have to get this book. So
That's awesome.
you already won somebody over in that short amount of time.
That is great.
Now, I mentioned a couple of your other books, The Marian Option and The Anti-Mary Exposed. It feels to me like The End of Woman is kind of, it's kind of picking up in some ways, or maybe going deeper than where those books have started to open some questions. You went a little bit deeper and kind of have drawn out the fundamental issues that we're facing a little more starkly. Am I right in that?
No, you're exactly right. The part of the idea for this book really came from writing the Anti-Mary Exposed, and so many people asked me, "Can you please make a book that I can give to Protestants or I can give to secular people?" Because there's just so much that's kind of deeply Catholic about this that it's really hard to give to women or to men, and have them sort of get beyond some of the ideas that are so Catholic. Obviously the title itself is very Catholic. So that had been in the back of my mind, was I wanted to write that book but I couldn't just rewrite the Anti-Mary Exposed just in secular terms. It had to be sort of a new contribution. And so I started really looking into, what are the things that I had learned since writing this book, the Anti-Mary Exposed, 5 years ago. And but what were where was the new research? And one of the areas that I knew I hadn't really dug into yet that I really wanted to dig into was first wave feminism. And naively I thought, I can spend maybe 2 days researching that and I'll be great. I'll find some really good quotes from Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Mary Wollstonecraft and whomever, and I can use those in other ways. But I just had to go back and look for myself because, I don't know if you've heard this, but I know a lot of people have heard that first wave feminism was actually really good, that it was a very kind of pure kind of feminism. And that's really what a lot of people have directed us back to, that we need to just go back to that, forget the second wave. We just can kind of link into the first wave and return to that. So in any event, I was just shocked when I started looking into the first wave of feminism, because I, again, had this impression it was going to be rosy and simple and lovely. And, I just couldn't believe what I found once I was there. And that's really what has become really the meat of the first half of the book, really, is just recognizing the patterns that I saw emerge very, very clearly from these women in the first wave, and how they created this foundation that then made the second wave just kind of a shoe-in and a very easy thing to explode, and really the blossoming of the first wave. So that was kind of the pattern, or the process through which it all came about.
So when you talk about this first wave, and first of all, I didn't know there was a first wave and a second wave and all that. I'm just not totally tuned into the whole argument. I'm sorry.
Okay,
which is one of the reasons why this is so eye-opening, right? When you read this, you're like, oh, okay, now this is all making sense. Yeah. You say, is it the first wave of feminism that you're talking about that has its origins in the French Revolution?
Yes. So the first wave is roughly from, I think people would say probably the 1790s up until 1963, roughly, when Betty Friedan published the Feminine Mystique. I think that's kind of the marker when the second wave happened. There's third and fourth waves. We don't need to get into those because they just get messier and messier and more contorted. And, and I think a lot of reasons people don't know much about this is these are just not fun things to read. I mean, they're very dark, they're painful. There's a lot of contortions that happen in the works themselves that are difficult to parse out. Like, what is this person doing and why are they doing that? And kind of getting into the minds of these women is not at all a fun process. So I have deep sympathy for people that don't know these waves, and even feminists themselves. I mean, that was one of the funny things, was just to see how many women who call themselves feminists have never looked back at any of this and realized, what they're really engaging in.
Okay, so what's the French Revolution? Like, let's trace it back to the beginning then. What's the origin story here of this first wave?
Okay, so Mary Wollstonecraft is sort of considered the grandmother of feminism. The name itself wasn't being used at that stage, but Mary is this writer who is English, and she's a huge fan of the French Revolution. She's actually a friend of Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine, he never met a revolution he didn't like. He certainly is known in the American Revolution, but then he moved over to the French Revolution, and was incredibly focused on just tearing down everything about French culture. He has this piece that he writes called the Rights of Man. And he's had been a friend of Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is an Englishman who's incredibly critical of Thomas Paine and of the French Revolution, and wrote this book called The Reflections of the French Revolution from England. And he's basically saying, like, what are you people doing? Like, you're cutting off all these heads of all these people indiscriminately. There's blood everywhere. But not only are you destroying individuals, you're just destroying the entire fabric of your culture. You're getting rid of the church, you're getting rid of monarchy, you're getting rid of the military. All of these things are just being decimated. So Mary Wollstonecraft enters into the scene because she actually writes a follow-up in response to Burke that's called The Vindication of the Rights of Man. Again, kind of riffing off of Thomas Paine's work called The Rights of Man. And then she writes a follow-up called The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And that's the piece that is sort of the cornerstone of the feminist movement. Most people don't know any of this context. And, they also don't know that she had 2 children. She conceived 2 children out of wedlock. She actually was saved. The father of her first child was an American, and she was saved from the guillotine because he had told the American embassy that she was his wife, even though they never got married. And as an American, she was protected from the guillotine, and went on to obviously write more books, have had another daughter who we know now as Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. So Mary Wollstonecraft's husband is actually also very much an intellectual celebrity as well during this time. He's a huge fan of getting rid of monogamy. He thinks it's a kind of slavery for women. So there's all these ideas that are stirring around that she's grasping onto, specifically this idea of getting rid of anything related to the hierarchy and just crushing culture, getting rid of the church, getting rid of military, getting rid of monarchy, all of that. So she teams up with William Godwin. They get pregnant before they're married. And so it's kind of a coup because they decided to actually get married when Mary Wollstonecraft got pregnant, because of course, here's this man that his whole career is built around this idea of how bad monogamy is. And he ends up getting married. And very tragically, Mary Wollstonecraft dies in childbirth about 10 days after Mary Godwin Shelley is born. So all of these ideas are just this swirling of, the revolution, of this effort to flatten things. And, I connected up with what's happening in the current day by recognizing this is really the foundation stone of what became smashing the patriarchy. This idea of patriarchy is bad, men are bad, the way in which men organize culture, the authority that men have given to them through God, through scripture, through the church, all of that has to be erased. And that is, very specifically came from these revolutionary ideas and, all the blood of the French Revolution.
One of the things that struck me, and you kind of lay this out in the book, is that so much of the pattern of people involved in the movement were wounded, right? Yeah. They had terrible things happen to them or did terrible things or whatever. And it seems like a lot of the ideas that were fomented there had to do with this woundedness.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a major theme of the book that I had seen already in the second wave, but I wasn't sure about it again in the first wave. And, Mary Wollstonecraft is a perfect example of that. I mean, she had these horrible parents, his father who was an alcoholic and was very brutal, and her mother who was, by all counts, this just very broken, submissive woman who and I mean submissive in a disordered way. Right. But she had this great affection for her first son. And then all the other children that she had after that, she didn't have any affection for. And so Mary Wollstonecraft was always trying to please her mother and protect her mother. And, from her father, whom actually, there's one horrible story about him hanging the family dog in some fit of rage. And, you can imagine being a small child and seeing that. So if your model of parenting are the alcoholic dog hanging father who's, sexually abusing and beating up his wife, and then the wife who's completely living in this very bizarre, unaffectionate world, you can see very easily how Mary Wollstonecraft is going to have a disordered understanding of what it means to love love each other, to understand the role of men, all of those kinds of things, and why this has why the idea of getting rid of all of these things has a certain appeal to her. And, she's certainly not the only one. There's just this incredible pattern that happens over and over again throughout the centuries, the 200 years of feminism, of all these women who are broken. And the interesting thing is that their response is not, let's go back to something ordered under the 10 Commandments. It's the exact opposite. How do we scuttle the church? How do we scuttle the 10 Commandments? How do we scuttle God's design and plan and vision, and kind of recreate our own and a new one, and do things in a way that seems very, very reasonable, and move forward in that direction. If we get rid of these things, then these problems won't exist anymore.
You mentioned Mary Shelley. And so this is, and correct me if I'm wrong in the genealogy here, this is Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And she is the one who wrote Frankenstein later, which was an eye opener. Like, what? Like, where did that come from? But you kind of play it out and you're like, well, there's a reason she wrote Frankenstein, right? And you kind of, lay that out later. But you also mentioned in regards, I think, to Mary Shelley, if I remember correctly, just the role that the occult kind of, and spiritualism and such kind of played in all of that. How does that fit into all of this?
Yeah, so this was one of the amazing things. I mean, I think at different points in history, we sort of see this like bouillon cube of ideas that sort of disseminates in ways that are totally not equivalent to the influence of the individuals involved. And yet, because of timing and all of that, and the Shelleys and Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin are the parents. They have Mary Godwin, who ends up marrying Percy Shelley, who's the English poet. So she becomes Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And I always feel like I need like a visual to show people, just to keep all of this, keep track of all of this. But what's interesting about it is just to see the role that Percy Shelley played in all this, because I think we think of feminism as, just this very female driven effort. And, the real definition of feminism, the way that we've come to understand it in a specific way, if you look at 200 years of it and see sort of the common characteristics of it, those are put together by Percy Shelley. So this English poet is sort of, while Mary Shelley's writing Frankenstein, he's very much involved in the occult, and that was one of the key pieces. So that's what he kind of brought to it himself. I mean, he got sent down from Oxford because he wrote a piece on atheism, but then he was also very much excited by the idea of reaching out to the devil. He spent the night in a tomb one night so he could contact the devil. All these wild things he's doing in his personal life. Not to mention, he's also just this incredible cad. When he meets Mary Godwin at her father's house, basically Shelley is meeting with Godwin because Godwin is this celebrity and hates marriage, and he's all dialed into that, even though he's married with a second child on the way. Godwin wants Shelley there because Godwin always needed money, and Shelley was this, very blue-blooded son who was set to inherit a lot of money, and so he could loan people money based on that. And so that they sort of form this relationship. Well, then he falls in love with Mary Godwin Shelley, later Shelley, and leaves his wife, who commits suicide. There's just this story after story of all these suicides and dead children and just tragedy, because this man is very much committed to the idea of free love, and which is the second characteristic. So you have the cult, you have free love, which is defined as sort of no monogamy, sort of sexual relationships, what we see today, without any kind of attachment. And then the third piece he got from his mother-in-law, which really inspired it. I mean, obviously they never met one another, but was this idea of what he called the women's revolution. This idea of getting rid of the patriarchy, getting rid of any kind of hierarchy. But most remarkably, Shelley had the vision to see that what he wanted was to get rid of gender altogether. He wanted to get rid of the sexes entirely. So it's really amazing that, he's writing this in about 1810, 1820, closer to 1820, I guess. And this is, and the ideas that we're all living with right now, the free love, the occult, and getting rid of the patriarchy and any kind of hierarchy. So that's where it was really set in this idea of the women's revolution. And that's what, moving forward in the 1800s, really animated so much of the feminist movement.
So much of what basically we're talking about women wanting to break free of these constraints that they see that were holding them down because their lives were miserable. And the way to do that was through some kind of sexual freedom really is kind of a lot of what happens, and they want to get rid of the male constraints and even their holdover as sexually. And really, at the end of the day, all it's doing is objectifying other people,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, kind of
Yeah.
draw that out for us, because in seeking freedom, really, and they're enslaving themselves through that, because by seeking your own sexual freedom, you're like, oh, it's my pleasure. So you're being enslaved by
Right.
your passions while you're objectifying other people at the same time. Like,
Yeah.
how can you help me express myself? And it becomes self-love.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And Shelley's didn't write any of this out in sort of a long form prose. It was all in his poetry. And there was this woman named Cynthna that he created. Again, there's Frankenstein, and he's creating Cynthna. And she's this woman who's independent, the first independent woman really in literature, who doesn't have a husband. She has no children. And that was the model that he thought women needed to follow, because the main question of feminism is not how do we help women as women. The main question feminism has asked almost from the beginning is, how do we help women become like men? So if you see that question, suddenly all the issues that we're dealing with in the current culture make perfect sense. We've been trying to make women like men for a very, very long time. Why? Because men don't have fertility. They don't have the constraints and the vulnerability that is associated with fertility. So the effort has been, and in Shelley's case, he just wanted to skirt it entirely, like just ignore the fertility. And this is, moving forward to the 1900s, this is where you see Margaret Sanger and the others, and, we can talk about this later, but getting into this idea of the pill and really controlling our fertility. And of course, this all morphs into abortion. We have to have abortion, that, the culture tells us, because this is what makes us like men. So it's really diabolical when you start seeing it, because from the very beginning, it's a disordered sense of what womanhood is, and trying to transform it into something that it really isn't. But it leads to what, like you were referring to, this kind of narcissism and this idea of how, trying to fulfill ourselves through self instead of pouring ourselves out for others, and really getting rid of that notion altogether of that deeply Christian idea.
Are you or a group you're part of seeking authentic Catholic spiritual teaching that will finally provide understandable, serious direction? Do you want to learn to pray more deeply and make actual spiritual progress? If so, I'd like to introduce you to the Science of Sainthood. It's an online teaching platform that offers step-by-step, beautiful video courses on prayer and Catholic spirituality for individuals, families, and groups. Based on spiritual giants like Saints Augustine, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and many others, it will set your heart on fire. The Science of Sainthood is dynamic, practical spiritual guidance that zeroes in on what Jesus himself calls the one thing necessary: the spiritual life. We offer personal study kits, group studies with workbooks, leader guides, and certificates, as well as online family memberships with access to 20 incredible series and counting. You've never seen anything like this until now. Go to scienceofsainthood.com and experience what tens of thousands of Catholics the world over have already discovered. Scienceofsainthood.com. More than education, this is transformation.
Well, you brought her up, so let's talk about Margaret Sanger.
Margaret.
Explain, because she always comes up in these kinds of discussions.
I know.
With all this stuff about birth control and eugenics.
Yeah.
Explain real quickly for people who don't know what eugenics is and where the whole birth control thing fits into all of this.
Yeah, so Margaret Sanger is another one of these lost girls that she grew up in this family with a very revolutionary father. Her mother had a lot of children, and she just saw the difficulties of her mother's life. But she followed in her footsteps. She got married. She had several children. There's actually some really lovely quotes that I have in the book from her talking about how much she enjoyed the early years of her motherhood. And then she and her husband moved to France. And it was at that stage that she met all these revolutionaries. Now, of course, some of it was already very familiar because of her father's leanings. But this is the point where she just became incredibly active in promoting birth control. And she actually even coined the phrase that term birth control comes from her. So she just gets more and more deeply involved in this. She and her husband divorce, or at least are separated. I can't remember if they ever officially divorced. And at one point she's has to leave the country. She goes back to Europe, and she's basically hiding out because she's doing things that are illegal. in the United States, because of course it was illegal, and all churches recognized the illicitness of it and whatnot until about around 1936. So anyway, she goes on to, and eventually, I mean, there's just all these sad stories too of her having to leave her children in the United States with other people because she can't take them with her because of, she's running from the law. So she becomes very deeply involved in sort of communist ideas and whatnot. But she ends up founding Planned Parenthood because her whole thing is, why do we have all these children that are just a drag on society? Why are we allowing these parents to have these children who are just this incredible weight on the culture? They have sad lives, all of the eugenics kinds of stuff. Like if we can sort of start culling out some of these children that, these families are too big and or these people that are too poor, then that's really going to be the savior that the culture is looking for. And that's what her work eventually turns into Planned Parenthood, and all of those ideas are animating that so much. Even into the current day, we see this in the way in which Planned Parenthood, where they're selecting where they put their clinics, and that comparatively, who's being aborted more, is it white babies or black babies? I mean, the numbers are just shocking when you start realizing the disparities between those numbers. So she's behind all that.
And isn't it interesting, Carrie, when you think about this? So on one hand, the first wave and every other wave probably after that wants to break free of sexual mores and get rid of all these cultural mores that keep them repressed, which leads to unwanted pregnancies and all the rest of that kind of stuff, which leads to birth control and eugenics, so that we can kill the babies that come out of the bad behavior that the first wave and every other wave actually promotes. And so it's this kind of just spiral of death, basically, at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly what we're seeing right now. What's happened in Ohio and Michigan and all these other places that are putting the abortion into their constitutions, because up until this point we had Roe v. Wade sort of as an overarching thing. We didn't really realize how deeply it had gotten into the culture and how much power the culture has to influence those who've either had an abortion or think it's reasonable or are somehow involved and think it's an important thing. And so now we're seeing, just it bubble up and see how much abortion has controlled the minds of women. And I think that's the saddest thing, because especially when you look at who's doing the killing. I recently had someone tell me, because I've made the public argument, that at a certain point, the only thing that we can really compare this to are all the mass slaughters that have happened by Hitler or Stalin or Mao, or all these awful revolutions that have happened under communism. I think feminism is the worst of all of them. The numbers are much, much larger than anything that Hitler did. But the worst part about it is these are not soldiers who are killing people that they don't know. These are parents killing their own children. And that is the distinctive difference. And what feminism has really done and wrought in our own age is it's broken that fundamental bond between mother and child in a way that nothing else historically ever has. We've never seen this kind of mass killing on this scale. And I think if the children were larger, if we had bodies, much larger bodies, and they weren't just carried away in the toxic waste containers, then we would be much more scandalized by it. These numbers would sort of make a deeper impression upon us, the way that, you see the piles of dead bodies at Auschwitz, those images, and the smoke hanging over Krakow because they're burning the bodies. It's hard to talk about these things because I think they're ugly, and awful and horrible. But I think we have to talk about them because this is having a huge effect on the fabric of all of our culture. And, certainly Catholics are not immune to this. We abort and contracept at the same rates almost as every other woman in the culture. I think these are things that we have to really expose and just recognize that where did this come from? It's come from specifically from feminism itself.
Speaking as a resident of Ohio, where this horrible amendment was just passed, it seems pretty obvious that even though we have these legal victories like Roe v. Wade, we're seeing states just fall one after the other because of what you're saying, which is one of the reasons why it's so important that we have to win back it's not just a legal question. It's the culture at large. It's the
Yeah.
heart of man. It's who we are in
Yeah.
God. And unless we can answer that question, we're done for. It's over. What I mean, so your work is helping expose a lot of this, but like,
what else do we do?
what do we do? I mean, it's so it seems so daunting, you know?
Yeah, it is daunting, but I think that the first thing that we have to do is start recognizing what the church actually teaches and start teaching that. I think there's been all this effort to really conflate feminism with Catholicism, and it's just, what do we have to show for it? It's a lot of confusion out there. Women do not know how to behave. In fact, I was just speaking recently with some other moms about Catholic schools have the same behavioral issues with girls as public schools. Maybe it's not as extreme, but the bullying, the mean girl, the girl boss, all of those kinds of things. In fact, if you ask a principal what his major issue is in the school in terms of discipline, it's always invariably right now it's girls' issues. Where is that coming from? It's coming from older women. It's coming from the culture. It's coming from what's being modeled to them all over. So we've gotten away from this idea of what a good woman is, and we've funneled women into this belief that their value is in their success and their power and their control. And so this is why we're seeing all of this on, very young girls. Not to say that girls haven't always done this. I mean, it's sort of hardwired into us. And I think there's some good books, one of which is called Warriors versus Worriers, that talks about this, international phenomenon in every culture. It's not just feminism. It's sort of this inborn way in which women fight. And a lot of it is not out in the open the way that men do because of our vulnerability and the way our bodies are built and all of that. But feminism has absolutely exacerbated this. And, I know you've seen it and encountered it. There's so much, there's this kind of bravado that I see it in Catholic women an awful lot. This idea of, we want to conquer, we want to be empowered. We want, it's buying into all of this idea about gaining power because we're victims. And this is really what feminism has laid out for us in the 1900s, and especially is men are the oppressors, women are the oppressed. And in order to not be oppressed, we have to be these aggressive, assertive, very narcissistic kinds of women who are denying, the importance of our husbands and our children. Those things are kind of obstacles or options. If you want to take those on, but they're not essentials anymore. So the problem is really a very, very big one. But I think it can be solved very much by the way it was created, through media, through magazines, through visuals. And this is, why Noelle, Mary, and I have started Theology of Home. We just published our fourth book, Theology of Home, Arranging the Seasons. We didn't actually write it. Our friend Emily Malloy wrote it. And it's just this gorgeous book about flowers and the liturgical season. And, I think we hear this kind of stuff and we just think this is really fluffy and not important. Like, where's the hard evidence and reason-based arguments? And, certainly Noelle and I have done both of that. But we realize that women have been converted very slowly and subtly to the left through fashion magazines, through home shows, through cosmetics, all these things that we just sort of take in our daily lives over and over again. That same message is being presented to us. And so why are we as Catholics not doing the same thing? Why are we not presenting these beautiful things that have our message in it? And so that's what we've been doing with Theology of Home. And it's been incredibly rewarding to just see, first of all, how much our first book, Theology of Home 1, how much it's sold and how many different languages it's gone into already, which tells us people are really hungry for this kind of content. But I think we have to get to a point where we start seeing the fluff is what's destroying us, and we are not anywhere in the fluff. We've allowed the left to take over all of it, from celebrities, politics, Hollywood, all of this, and we need to start putting some of our money into these efforts instead of just letting them steamroll through, these low information voters, and allow them to keep believing that the left has got the only answer to what it means to be a woman.
Which
isn't really an answer, actually.
Yeah.
They don't actually ever give you an answer.
You kind of played all this out in some of your previous books with regard to the glamour magazines and all the rest of that kind of stuff. And really, it's just a facade of beauty. It's a sham. And that the women behind all those things, if it wasn't just out right, bold-faced lying. They never
Yeah.
told you about the destruction that it wrought, behind the scenes, and were they really fulfilled? And no, they weren't. And because it's just a kind of diverting a distraction away from the true beauty that is God. And I think you're absolutely right. We have to bring back the beautiful into the Catholic conversation, not in the fluffy daytime TV kind of way, but
Mm-hmm.
in a way that really validates who we are as human beings, because God is truth, beauty,
Right.
and goodness, right? It comes from him. There's this objectivity there to beauty that we need to tap into, because there's no argument against it, right?
Yeah.
We're drawn to this
Right.
because of how it is that we are made.
And that is absolutely key. I mean, I think this is one thing, like when people hear this idea, they're sort of like, I can't imagine that. And part of it is because we haven't done it well. There's so much kitsch in the church, and there's so much that's done very poorly and isn't beautiful. It's not compelling. But when you actually start to get, this is what we were just absolutely adamant about with our books, was they had to be beautiful. We hired an outsider kind of photographer. This wasn't like my cousin that took the picture. We had this amazing photographer do these photographs on a very high professional level. And that was really important to us. And I think that's what people are really drawn to and interested in. And when you have that message presented, it wins people over so easily because of the fact that it speaks directly to our hearts and to the desires of our hearts. And I think that we have a lot of data too about what it is that most women want. And it's not, I want to be, by myself in my 70s or 60s or 50s, even, with several cats. Like, that's not the goal. And that's really what feminism doesn't tell us from the very get-go, is that what it is leading you to is a kind of isolation, because you think you are the one who's going to fulfill everything, instead of recognizing you got to build something. You're meant to build and create. And some of that is going to happen through your own vulnerability in pregnancy. Or maybe you aren't meant to be single, but you're still meant to mother other people. Motherhood isn't just a biological reality. It's also psychological and spiritual reality. And, nobody has a better understanding of this than the Catholic Church, with the cloistered nuns, religious women. These are women who mother us spiritually on so many levels. This is why they're, the abbess is called Mother. The leader is called Mother. So I think that it's exciting when you start realizing kind of the abundance of riches that we have, and what it is that we can actually communicate to people, instead of feeling like, I don't know how to explain this, or I don't know how to give this to people. Because when you start giving them something concrete and beautiful and compelling, they want more of it. And so I think that's the exciting thing, is that this is totally untapped, or largely untapped. And it's just, people are just waiting for us to articulate these things in a way that's compelling and beautiful, instead of, cheesy and tired.
No, I'm with you 100%. Actually, this is one of the reasons why, not to sound like a commercial, but like in the Science of Sainthood, like it's professionally produced. You have to have beauty. There has to be something that's intrinsically gorgeous about it, because that's part of the message, right?
Yeah.
And if we don't do that, then we've lost. And I applaud all that you guys are doing with Theology of Home and all the rest, and keep it up. We need more and more of it.
Well, thank you. And I will say, the other thing that's vital for women is it has to have some kind of fun about it. Like that, I think that's the other piece that we really overlook, is just this recognition of how these things are really fun and rewarding, whether it's gardening or cooking for others or hospitality or, this is, the culture's tapped into this. Why haven't we recognized these things? We've been doing these things longer and better. Why haven't we recognized that this is really, there's joy in doing all of these things too?
Even Cyndi Lauper said girls just want to have fun, right?
She did. I don't think I would quote her.
No, I didn't see her in the book at all.
She's not in the book. I didn't put Cyndi in the book. No.
It makes sense when you're talking about really, in a lot of ways, what the feminist movement has done is destroyed just maternity, right? I mean, it's just crushing that entire idea. And it makes sense that this is the kind of demonic aspect of it, since John Paul II talks about how God is family, right? He has within himself fatherhood, sonship, and the essence of the family, which is love, which is a description of the Holy Spirit, and this kind of maternal aspect, so to speak, in God. But it makes sense that you're crushing the patriarchy, you're smashing maternity. And at the end of the day, all this does is leave you lonely and broken because you're
Yeah.
crushing the very the fabric of how
Mhm.
it is that we were made to live, not just now, but for all
Yeah.
eternity. And so it
Right.
makes sense that this is
Right.
where the battle is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you for laying that out so beautifully and more theologically than I usually do. I think that's exactly right. And this is precisely why we see women as that are so unhappy. I've been really motivated by looking at the metrics of, well, what's happened to women since feminism started? And nothing good. There's not any metric that shows that women are happier. Yes, maybe they have more in their bank accounts, or maybe they have more professional degrees. But when you look at the things that really tell the story, things like suicide rates and depression rates and substance abuse, and even things like, STDs, all of those things point to some women who are very broken, very unhappy. Abortion rates are part of that as well, and contribute to all those things significantly. So that's the saddest part, is that we continue to be lied to that feminism is something that we just can't live without. And in fact, it's doing exactly what you described. It's really destroying us, not just on an earthly level, but on an eternal level, for sure.
You made a comment previously that I want to bring back up again, because in chapter 15, you quote a French philosopher named Simone de Beauvoir.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really telling statement. Did I pronounce that correctly? I took high school French
Close.
class.
Beauvoir.
Okay.
Sure.
Beauvoir.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
All right. Beauvoir.
That's all right.
Beauvoir. Tomato.
That's
All right.
close. You're fine. Do not butcher it.
Here is the quote. One is not born, but rather becomes woman. And I thought, there it is in a nutshell. This is the fundamental problem with, all the gender confusion, because it's really all about a separation of body and soul. And of course, as I continue to read, you basically said the exact same thing.
Right. But you saw it. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of backstory to that. I didn't go into Nietzsche in the book. I was trying to make sure the book didn't feel too academic. And so,
and it's not at all. It's super duper readable, just so everyone knows. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was very intentional. How many times have I read great academic works and thought, I can't give this to anybody. I want people to read this. And so that was really intentional part of it. But yeah, Simone de Beauvoir was friends, pals, lovers with Jean-Paul Sartre and Sartre, I guess we could say.
What a happy couple. Oh my goodness.
If we're gonna, very happy couple. I think they were kind of happy until she realized that he was leaving his whole estate to his another mistress. And meanwhile, she's like keeping house for him. But the whole idea of that they were focused on was expressing your authentic self. So that started initially from Nietzsche. They're the ones that sort of blew this idea up, and that phrase that sentence that you just quoted is really has been used by the trans movement, and just this idea again that you can sort of become anything that you want to become, as long as you're authentic to your true self, whatever that might mean for you. So it all started right there.
Which is interesting because, medically speaking, the separation of body and soul is death, right? I mean, you're nothing at that point.
Right.
And it's just a denial of reality at the end of the day.
And that's really the whole goal of all of it is you can see that this denial of human nature as it is. If we could believe that we can turn women into men, this has been the push. So it is a denial of human nature, and it's a denial of the importance of fertility and the role that it plays in society and the family and all of that. So yeah, I think that's a nutshell.
And really, I mean, what we're saying is you can become what it is that you were made to be, which is divine, right? But you can become it on your own. You can fulfill that on your own. And really, we're just going back to the Garden of Eden again. I want to elevate myself instead of allowing God to do that inside of me. I want it on my own terms. And that's really self-love. It's the fundamental thing that the spiritual life fights, and there's a reason. And you see how it's playing out in society now. When you are only focused on yourself, it's just the death to everything that makes you a human person.
Yeah. And, curiously, you bring that up. This was one of the main ideas that Percy Shelley also talked about, was imagining Genesis 3 and the fall of Adam and Eve. And, he goes back, he's inspired by Milton in this, but his main idea that got carried through Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others was that this was actually an opportunity for Eve, that, this wasn't really the fall wasn't really a bad thing, but this was an opportunity for her to gain this kind of knowledge that she would need to be conquer and whatnot. And this is one of those patterns that you see all over and over again. So I think there's that bumper sticker that I've seen several times, but then I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, where there's a lot of feminists everywhere per capita. I think it's a huge number. The line something like Eve was framed, this idea that she came up, this was an opportunity for her, and that she came up with something. It was the way in which she was meant to really be involved in the world was through these ideas that she got from the serpent. So,
yeah, the opportunity turned out very well for all of us. So and we kind of touched on this a little bit. I tried to get an answer out of you, which is going to solve everything. But like, how do we reclaim everything? And I thought your answer to this it made absolute sense to me. But just to kind of preface the situation that we're now facing, you mentioned a study from the 1920s from J.D. Unwin, who was an anthropologist at Oxford and an atheist, who studied 80 primitive tribes and 6 civilizations spanning 5,000 years. And the results were that as soon as culture abandoned monogamy, particularly premarital chastity, you said, it collapsed within 3 generations, about 100 years by his calculations.
Yeah.
That's mind-boggling.
Mind-blowing. Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's amazing.
And you step back and you're like, what are we going to do now? Because, right? I mean, look at where we are.
Yeah. Well, especially in light of the fact that he describes precisely the way in which the culture collapses. Monogamy ends, faith is lost, and so is reason. There's no more reason left in the culture. And that's exactly where we're at. I mean, if you look around, there's no faith, there's no reason. It's all emotions and sensory experience. And, marriage is dying on the vine. So yeah, it's pretty amazing to see and this was also primitive cultures that didn't have social media. They didn't have instantaneous ways of communicating with each other. So yeah, I think it's pretty heavy when you start seeing that, but it also, and I deal with this a little bit in the Marian option too, this idea of that Pope Benedict talked about of creative minorities, these small groups that go back to living the way in which God wanted them to live. And they start creating, and sort of filling in the rot that the culture is, brought about on its own. So that there's hope in that. And I think that, a lot of the creative minorities, especially in the last millennia, have been motivated and inspired by the Virgin Mary. So going back to that, I think that there's certainly a lot of hope there. And I think even if you look at the kind of devotion that people have to Our Lady that I know, was not a thing back in the 70s and 80s, it feels like it's been sort of relatively new that Marian devotions have caught on in the ways that they have. So anyway, I think that there's a place for great hope. And I think also just the fact that, we've got this woman who's Our Lady, who's leading us and has led so many of these amazing ways in which Christianity has salvaged itself over the centuries. It's not lost that what is being destroyed are women who are really meant to be an icon of who Our Lady is. We've gotten to this point where we can't even define what a good woman is, much less imagine, helping people understand who a perfect woman is. So all of that is obviously very intentional. And, I talk about that in the Anti-Mary Exposed, but it's that we can make it very complicated and say, well, we have to do this and that, but it gets very easy when you start realizing we have the Blessed Mother who knows what God's mission is for us and our lives and wants to direct us. And it's very simple. We just have to have a relationship with her through Marian consecration, the Rosary. I mean, these are not difficult things. And then from there, that's really where she can work in our lives and direct us to the kind of mission that can help restore civilization in ways that we could never begin to imagine on our own. So I think it can be simple, but it's hard to trust in that, and it's also hard to communicate that to people. But people are getting to the point, I think, too, where they're more open to these ideas than they were, even 5 years ago, because of what we're
Well, when you see the
around
destruction that's been wrought, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that makes sense that they're a little more open to it. I think that, where, J.D. Unwin's data leads us is that chastity in some ways is the key, right? And marriage
Vital.
is
Yeah,
the key.
exactly.
That's the
Yeah.
underlying element of that we've got
Mhm.
to bring back. And so as Catholics who are married, we have to celebrate this more, right? Not in an in your face way, but marriage
Right.
has to become beautiful again.
Yeah.
And if our marriages are going to become beautiful again, then obviously, to draw it back, we have to focus on the truth, beauty, and the goodness of God inside of
Mhm.
ourselves with our own personal spirituality, our move toward personal holiness, which then plays out in a kind of a ripple effect in our
Mhm.
marriage, our children, and
Mhm.
those around us. And that's really, it always comes back to personal holiness, right? I
It
mean,
does.
at the end of the
Yeah.
day, that seeking to become like God on a personal level is what affects everybody else.
Yeah. And I think in light of all that, it's one of the pieces that is absolutely essential is for us, to women in particular, to be able to detox from feminism. And that's something that we don't talk about enough. I mean, this is really why this book feels so important, because it helps women understand that not only has the left defined feminism, but they've also defined their opposition. They've used just incredible propaganda. So, for example, anytime there's some sort of political something going on, who shows up? The women in the red bonnets and the red dresses. Like, that Handmaid's Tale image is absolutely linked with this idea of fertility cults and just all these distortions that they are telling the world, this is what you're going to end up being like if you are not on board with these feminists. So they show up. You've got the Stepford wife image. You've got the doormat image, all of that. So this is the hard thing that I think so many women, we don't realize the ways in which we've been manipulated, is that we think there's this binary option of, here's these, the radical feminists that are the cool girls, or we've got the doormat, Handmaid's Tale women. Like, what woman wants to be that woman? Instead of course, Aristotle's mean, like, there's an ordered woman in the middle of that, who is not a doormat and who's not, the radical feminist either. And that's what I think we've got to start seeking out and figuring out how to articulate that, because she's a beautiful woman. This is a woman who's desiring what is authentically good. She's the woman that understands my life. The thing that I can do the best is to help draw people out of themselves and bring the best out of them. I mean, that's what mothering is. We do it biologically with nourishing others, sheltering others, emotionally, like being there for others and helping them see what their gifts are. We do it spiritually. I mean, how many of us are praying for our children constantly, even when we're not around our children? This is what motherhood and womanhood is really meant to be about. And so we have to get back to those very concrete things and get out of ourselves. And this is why there's so many struggles in marriage, is because so many women believe that the marriage is in some ways meant to just serve them, instead of them to be part, united with their husband and serving their children and serving the community. And from there comes, real joy and beauty. So all of those things have to sort of be untwisted. And it's very hard to do when for years this has been pounded into us. And I know, even in my own life, I've had to detox from this and figure out, in what ways have I absorbed the culture in a disordered way? And in what ways do I need to start rethinking myself in terms of God's will and vision for my life?
Well, practically speaking, what does that look like? Like, how do you detox? You just cut everything off? I mean, what do you do?
Yeah. No, I don't think you need to cut everything off, but I think we need to just start paying attention to, one great way, super simple, very interesting. Go back and read poetry or song lyrics that men have written about women over the centuries. They're not saying anything in there about a nagging wife. There's no love song about the nagging wife. They're not saying there's nothing in there about bravado and ambition and sharp elbows and manipulation. these are, and to sort of like intuit that. I mean, obviously you can do this in prayer, and the Blessed Mother will, guides us in that. But, I went through this stage. I was in my 30s and I had to figure out, like, why are all my ex-boyfriends marrying kindergarten teachers? And, it became painfully clear, like, felt like I had to be ambitious, all these things that I felt like I had to be, that were actually not even really who I was, really were playing themselves out. And I remember overhearing a conversation, I wasn't eavesdropping, I was in the room, but there was two men talking, and one of them said, "Oh yeah, she's really sweet." And I remember just thinking, I don't even know what that means. What does that mean to be really sweet? And why is that a good thing? So anyway, I think, I've told this story elsewhere, but I think ultimately, we have to, the Holy Spirit wants to guide every woman in this, and wants to see that divide that keeps getting wider between husbands and wives, wants to see that diminished. And this is the beauty of when we start detoxing from this, is it allows our husbands to become better husbands too, because the divide gets smaller. So anyway, I think it's incredibly challenging, but I think that there's a lot of resources out there in terms of just, the culture hasn't always been this bad. So if we look back at other areas and see what it is that makes women beautiful, then that's an incredible place to start, I think.
Augustine says, "Love and do what you will," and that was kind of popping through my head as you're talking.
Mm-hmm.
Love really is the key, and not in a kind of a fluffy way, but in the Trinitarian way. John of the Cross says that true equality happens in the Trinity, because the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit each give of themselves to the other, and so one isn't elevated above the other. There's equality. And that's the way it's supposed to work in our marital relationships as well. And so, again, this goes back to us working on ourselves, practicing virtue, praying, all those things to generate this love inside of ourselves, so that we can make a gift of ourselves to our spouse. And then you don't have to worry about the domination and all the rest of those kinds of things. It really is, it boils down to love at the end of the day. As hard and as simple as that is, love's what we have to work on. That's the key to all of this. I mean, chastity happens, to answer JD Unwin, chastity happens because of love. I love my wife. I'm not going to go be unfaithful, right? My gift of self is to her and to the other people that the Lord has brought into my life. It's not rocket science, but at the same time, it's really hard. And so we have to help culture at large understand the godly notion of love, instead of this sham of what it is they keep ramming down our throats. And I think part of what it is that The End of Woman and your other books have done, Carrie, is it gives people the ability to, when they encounter the daytime TV version of love, or even what's in movies and all the rest of it, you step back and you go, I see what you're doing here, right? And you begin to identify it, and then you can fight against it.
Yeah. And that's the first piece. I mean, we have to get to that point, and because it's everywhere around us. It's it's in Star Wars movies, it's in Barbie, it's in, this new Snow White that has just been delayed because of the outcry of the actress saying awful things about how bad, romance is. And so it's all of that we have to recognize the distortions of it. And I think that there's also something vitally important about women just even realizing that, we think we have such a disordered understanding of submission. And, I know that this has been an issue in my own marriage, as far as like, a good man is not going to crush a woman. Men don't like fighting with women. They don't. This is what good men do. And so this is why it's such an important thing for us to understand that we can't, that our lording our will and control and power over our husbands isn't going to ever bring order to the family. But it has to be something that's freely given, and that we start understanding, even in conversations with our spouses, about in what ways can I help so that we work together and we're communicating, instead of me sort of getting angry and laying down the law and then ending the conversation because he doesn't want to fight with me. So we see that all the time. And I think that's one of the real disastrous things that the culture has done, is telling us that, no, I won't be submissive. But we just then completely miss how that all works and how that all functions. And it's very hard to sort of start figuring that out. And especially if we've married good men who are not, going to want to crush us. It's incredibly important that we figure out that this is something that we have to give of ourselves in a beautiful and compelling way, not in a disordered way, instead of expecting a man to take it, or, just being in this marriage where we're constantly just struggling around this key issue of authority and power and control.
Yeah, and the same thing you just said goes for men. We can't lord any position that we have over our wife, our children, or anyone else. And
Yeah.
this is
Right.
what Christ shows us, right? We're supposed to lay
Yeah.
down our lives for them.
Right.
And
Yeah.
as soon as one spouse does that,
it's like magnets, right? Yeah.
It is.
Same side of a magnet. They just push further away instead of getting closer.
That's exactly right. And someone's got to, take the first steps. And it doesn't mean necessarily it's going to happen overnight, right? Because we all have wills and we're all disordered.
Right. There's a lot of water under the bridge sometimes that we have to sort through.
That's exactly right. And you do need to sort through those things, but having the fundamental basis of self-giving love and this attitude, not just toward our spouse and not just toward our children, but doggone it, even to our enemies, right? Which changes the way we even discourse with the rest of culture when we're confronted with a lot of the God-forsakenness of it. We have to do it in a godly way. It changes everything. And so that would be my number one kind of piece of advice, is that you have to focus on developing your love relationship with our Lord, because that's the font from which all of it flows. And then focus on your spouse. And if you're not married, then you focus on just the other people in your circle of friends and those around you, to begin to give of yourself in that way. And when you do that, you will notice that people who might have dealt with you harshly in the past are going to start to change the way they even approach you or deal with you. And that's the beginning of the healing of the wounded relationships that we all have. And that starts to take care of all of this on a bigger picture. Because if we all did that, it would be like those creative minorities that Benedict was talking about, where there's this flourishing of the human person in a whole new way that revitalizes all of civilization, like the Benedictines, establishing monasteries and, all over the place. And it just is a rebirth of culture, and it's a culture of love in and through Jesus Christ.
Super well said. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And that's been one of the things that has been most surprising and beautiful. But first, with the Anti-Marriage Exposed, but secondly, with this book, The End of Woman, is just to see how much men appreciate it, because of the fact that they've been, told that everything is their fault for at least 50 years. But more importantly, because it gives them a perspective of releasing the bitterness that they might feel towards women, because they realize women didn't choose this. This wasn't something that we woke up and said, I want to be this awful girl boss, controlling and nagging people. It's the exact opposite. It's something that's been imposed on us by the culture at large. And so I think when people see that, men and women, then suddenly you have a lot more compassion for the situation that we're in. You also have a lot more compassion for individuals that you're encountering. And you realize, like, these people have been victimized by this. This is not really, an option of the will. It's not like we've had all these ideas flying around the culture. There's been one narrative about how women ought to behave. And so when you really realize that, then it gets easier to love people, because you realize this is not, in so many respects, it's not their fault. And that opens the door, I think, to a kind of compassion that is very hard to find when you're thinking people, these women are just awful to be awful for its own sake.
Once your eyes begin to be opened in books like this one, if I can get that, there we go. Buy the book. It's fantastic. It will cause the scales to fall from your eyes and begin to help all of us, men and women, because guys don't even know what to do. Like, we don't even know how to respond lots of times in situations that come up. And so we have to, maintain charity and all the rest of it in light of all of this. But knowing where it all comes from for men and women, and how we've gotten to where we are today, as G.I. Joe says, knowledge is half the battle, right? So you've given us that, and we just have to act it out in the world, and that comes through the spiritual life. So you've done once again in this is this number 10? Is this the
Number
10th
10.
book?
Yeah.
Okay.
10th
I
book.
mean, it's epic. And I encourage
Thank you.
everyone to grab a copy and to read it, because it really is important for us to reclaim culture and civilization and our families, just to reclaim ourselves, for crying out loud, and who we are in God. You have to have this fundamental understanding of where things have gone haywire so that we can get it all back. So, Carrie Gress, where can people find out more about you and what you are into?
I have a personal website, carriegress.com, that has my latest articles and articles from probably the last 8 years. And then Theology of Home, of course, is the place I blog. Noelle Mehring and I have a daily blog. And this is also where our mercantile is, where we sell what we think are incredible books and lifestyle products and things that can help women live their faith out in very concrete ways in their homes.
Great. Well, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and I learn more every time I talk to you. I'm sure others do as well, and I look forward to what's coming down the pipeline next from you.
I think I need a break, but in any event, thank you so much. It's great to be with you as ever.
All right. God bless.
You too.